Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Digging Deeper moment number 37. If you have not already downloaded the outline of Revelation that we provided for you, we want to encourage you to do so because it really will help you in your study. You can get it on our website, YouTube, or Facebook. Now, we're in the second of four visions of the book of Revelation. Vision 1 begins with Jesus tending the seven lamps in the heavenly holy place in chapters 1 through 3. And Vision chapter 2 picks up where Vision 1 leaves off. Worship continues in heaven. In chapter 4, when John is taken up to the heavenly holy of holies and sees Jesus God on the throne. In chapter 5, he sees God hand Jesus a seven-sealed scroll. In chapter 6, he sees Jesus open the first of six seals. Chapter 7 interrupts the worship service, and in chapter 8, worship is resumed with the opening of the seventh seal. The seventh seal contains seven trumpets, which are blown in chapters 8 through 9. In Revelation chapter 10, verse 1 through chapter 11, verse 14, worship is interrupted again with a vision of John's prophetic call. Worship is then resumed in chapter 11, verse 15 through 19 with the blowing of the seventh trumpet. And in Revelations chapter 12 and 13 are the third of three interruptions of the heavenly worship service. Last week we looked at chapter 12. Tonight we look at chapter 13. The imagery of chapter 13 is taken from apocalyptic literature and also from the Old Testament book of Daniel. In chapter 13, it talks about two beasts. Revelation chapter 13, verse 1 through verse 10 talks about a beast that rises from the sea. John is on the Isle of Patmos, so he looks out at the Aegean Sea. In this vision, in this sea, he sees a beast rise from the sea. And in Revelation chapter 13, verse 18, he talks about a beast that rises from the land or from the earth. In Daniel and apocalyptic literature, beasts were used to symbolize kings and kingdoms, and that's what they symbolize here. The first beast in Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 through 10, is a kingdom. The beast that arises up out of the sea speaks of a kingdom, and then John gives us various descriptions of this beast that we're not going to have time to go into. This kingdom demands, though, that everyone worship it. We want to read this in chapter 13 of the book of Revelation. It says this, in Revelation chapter 13, verse 8. All who dwell on the earth will worship him. Who? He's speaking of this first beast that rose from the sea, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. So the whole idea is that this kingdom would enforce and make people worship it. That's the first beast, and it speaks of a kingdom. The second beast in Revelation chapter 13, verses 11 through 18, speaks of an individual beast. This beast is a person. And this beast, this king, it speaks of a king. This beast, this king will make everyone worship the first beast. In other words, whoever this king is, he will make them comply with the worship details of the kingdom. He will enforce the rules of the kingdom to worship the beast, that is the big beast, that is the kingdom or empire. Now the number of this beast is given to us. In other words, this individual has a number, and that number is 666. Now I don't have to tell anybody about 666. Everybody's heard about 666. In fact, there are a wide variety of interpretations of what this number 666 means. But what I want you to know tonight is that all interpretations of what this number means flows out or comes out of the method of interpretation a person uses to interpret the book of Revelation. And that's one of the reasons why there's so many different views on what this number actually means. A method of interpretation is the method we use to interpret the whole book. It's like a set of glasses that we put on when we read the book. Most people don't realize that when we read the book of Revelation, even the Bible, we put on sets of glasses that predetermine what we see in the book, and we have to be mindful of that. In the world of science, it's called a paradigm. A paradigm in the scientific world frames the data that the scientists look at. In other words, the scientists, and we're being told that they're totally objective, that's not totally true. Scientists have what's called paradigms, and that paradigm frames the data that they look at. Now, paradigm is a set of assumptions about what is being observed. Some people call this a worldview. It's a very similar thing. A worldview frames. A worldview is our assumptions about how the world operates. And so when we experience something, we interpret things through our worldview, through our paradigm, through our set of glasses, or through our method of interpretation. A method of interpretation is like a worldview. It's like a paradigm that has a set of assumptions built in that help us understand what we're reading. Now, when it comes to the book of Revelation, there's primarily four different kinds or four different methods of interpretation. And you'll note when you study these that whichever one of these sets of glasses you put on will influence what you see in the book. I'm not saying that it's wrong to have a method of interpretation. What I'm trying to do is make us aware that we all come into the book with that set of glasses on, and that's the reason why we often come up with different conclusions. The first of the four is the historical method. It sees Revelation as a prediction of world events that take place from the time of Christ's first coming to the time of His second coming. So basically, they see it as predicting history from the time of Jesus to His return. The second is called the preterist method. It sees Revelation as events that were basically predicted by John and others in the New Testament era and Jesus, but took place in the first century. They see mostly this stuff fulfilled already in the past, in the first century. The third method of interpretation is called the Futurist Method. It sees Revelation basically as a prediction of world events just prior to the second coming of Jesus Christ. And so you have events in the first century, and then you have silence. Basically, of all these events are silence. And then right before Jesus returns, these things kick in that the Revelation is talking about. And the fourth and final method is called the spiritual method. It sees Revelation as a record of divine principles that are present in all times and ages, but it has no real historical significance or connection with history. Now, most of us hold to one or several or some version of these four. And this is why we come up with different and opposing views of what it says. Like take 666, for instance. You know, if you take one of these four, you're going to look at it one way. If you take another of the four, you're going to look at it another way. And so my concern with all this is that often what Revelation actually says gets lost in our method of interpretation. And I said in our method of interpretation, because I have a method of interpretation too. And I have to be well aware of that when I teach the book. So a good question to ask when you hear a different idea on what Revelation says in any spot, especially with 666, but anywhere else, ask yourself this question. Is that what Revelation actually says, or is this an interpretation of what Revelation says? And that's a really good question. For instance, if you take Revelation chapter 13, it talks about two beasts, and it describes those beasts. Whatever else we say is an interpretation. My statement that the first beast is a kingdom and the second is a king is actually an interpretation. In order to make sense of it, I have to take what I know and I have to try to figure out what it's saying. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but what we want us to see is that we are all bringing a set of assumptions into the book with us that influence what we get out of it. And our goal is to continue to go to the text and try to figure out what it says and stay true to what it says and be careful that we don't read into the text something that it really doesn't say. And in a book like Revelation, it's kind of difficult because there's so much symbology, all right? And so the truth is, we must all interpret the text. Just remember that every one of us does that, and don't lose sight of it. Because this is important, because when people differ in their opinions of what they think it says, we should not argue with them. We should listen to the other interpretations to confirm, deny, or even enhance our own understanding. What I have learned over the years is that there's people that read the Revelation and they see different things, they get different outcomes or different interpretations than I do. But I have learned so much from them. Even though I still don't agree with them, I learn so much by listening to them because sometimes they challenge what I think I know, they point out sometimes my assumptions, and they even make corrections in what I think that I understood. And I think we're stronger together as we listen and learn from one another than we are if we argue. This is a beautiful book. It contains a lot of great truths. And I think the Lord had John write it this way so that we would learn how to have a dialogue with each other instead of just argue about it and just say this is what it says. I think that really helps us. Next week, we're going to pick up in chapter 14, and we're going to enter the end or the conclusion of the heavenly worship service. I'm looking forward to it. You're going to see some things in chapter 14 that you probably never heard before that are really quite exciting. So if you enjoyed this lesson, please share it with a friend. We'll see you next week.